There are moments in life when pain strikes so deeply that the heart trembles, the tongue falters, and the soul is left asking questions it never thought it would ask. In those moments, the human being can even feel anger towards the very one who gave them life. But what if I told you that even in that storm of grief, even when you are questioning, even when you are broken, Allah has not abandoned you. Rather, He is holding you closer than ever before. There was once a woman who lost her son, and in the depth of her grief, she whispered words that came from a place of brokenness. She blamed Allah. She looked at her loss. The empty bed where her child used to sleep, the silence where his laughter once filled the air, and her heart shattered in a way that only a mother's heart can understand. Her pain was so overwhelming that she could not make sense of how a merciful God could take away what she loved most. This is not a story of disbelief, it is a story of humanity, because when the storm of sorrow strikes, even the strongest of hearts can feel drowned. In that moment, her blame was not rejection of Allah, but a desperate cry from a wounded heart. And it is here that we must understand something profound. Allah never condemns us for feeling broken. He only calls us to return, to rise, to lean on Him when the weight of life feels unbearable. In grief, the heart looks for someone to hold responsible, and sometimes it is easier to point towards the one in control. But Allah does not get angry at our tears. He created them. He does not reject us when we question. He knows the depth of our struggle. In fact, the Prophet himself wept when he lost his own son, and he reminded us that the eyes shed tears and the heart feels sadness, but the tongue should remain patient with the decree of Allah. That patience does not mean we don't cry. It doesn't mean we don't ache. It means we don't lose hope in the one who holds every soul. The woman who blamed Allah thought she had failed, but what she did not know is that her son was not gone forever. In reality, her child was only transferred to a safer place, into the care of the one who loves him even more than she ever could. Every loss in this world is not an ending, but a relocation. When a mother loses her child, it feels like the universe has been ripped apart, but in truth, that child is waiting at the gates of paradise. In one narration, children who die young will take the hands of their parents and intercede for them until Allah admits them into Jannah. So the story of this woman is not one of despair but of hope, because her son became her ticket to eternal reunion, her light in the darkness, her means of nearness to Allah. What looked like punishment was actually mercy in disguise, though she could not see it through her tears. Her grief was real, so was the promise of Allah that those who are patient will meet their loved ones again in a place with no sorrow, no separation, no death. The journey of her heart was not about denying her pain, but about transforming it. At first, she blamed Allah because she could not understand, but over time, as she turned back to Him, she discovered that the very loss that broke her was the same loss that rebuilt her. Her son was gone from her arms, but not from her story, and his memory became the reason she prayed harder, trusted deeper, and walked closer to her Creator. This is the lesson of loss in Islam. It is not meant to destroy, but to direct. The pain is real, but so is the healing. The questions are real, but so are the answers. The loss feels final. The promise of reunion is more real than anything we see in this temporary world. So to the woman who blamed Allah after losing her son, and to anyone who has ever felt that pain, know this: Allah does not turn away from you when you are broken. He does not abandon you because your heart asked why. He is with you in your tears, closer than your jugular vein, waiting for the moment you shift from blame to surrender. And when you do, you will find that He was never punishing you. He was preparing you, not taking away, but saving for you, not closing the door, but opening one greater than you can imagine. For every hardship carries within it a hidden mercy, and every tear shed for Allah is seen, collected, and will one day be replaced with eternal joy. And so the story ends not with blame, but with love, not with despair, but with hope. Because Allah is the one who takes, but also the one who gives more in return. The child she lost in this world is not lost forever. He is waiting, and the mother who once blamed Allah will one day thank Him. Because what she thought was the end was actually the beginning of a reunion that will never be broken again. There was a woman who lost her son, and the grief that overtook her heart was so heavy that she could not carry it. So she broke beneath its weight, and her tongue uttered words of blame towards Allah, because in her pain, she could not reconcile the love she believed in with the loss she was facing. And this is the reality of human nature. When sorrow strikes deeply, it pushes the soul to search for answers, and sometimes those answers come out in ways that look like anger, doubt, or blame, but in truth, they are cries of helplessness. For Allah does not condemn the tears of His servants, nor the breaking of their hearts. He is the one who created those hearts and knows how fragile they can become in the face of tragedy. And the story of her blaming Allah is not a story of disbelief, but of humanity, because even the prophets cried when tested, and even they asked why in their moments of pain. Yet what distinguishes the believer is not that they never stumble, but that they eventually rise again and turn back. For the loss of a child is one of the hardest trials written in the books of Qadr, and in that trial lies hidden mercy that cannot be seen at first glance. Because when a child leaves this world, it is not a loss into nothingness, but a transfer into the care of the most merciful, who loves that child more than the mother herself. And the Islamic tradition gives hope to the grieving by teaching that the child who dies young becomes a source of intercession for the parents, meeting them at the gates of paradise and refusing to enter until Allah allows them to reunite. And so the pain that made her blame Allah is also the pain that can elevate her, because the very wound of separation in this world becomes the bond of reunion in the next. And her grief is not dismissed or belittled, but honored as a form of patience, because in Islam, patience is not the absence of tears or the denial of sadness. It is the choice to not lose hope in Allah, even when the heartache is. And so her story is one of transformation, because at first she felt anger, confusion, and distance. But over time, she began to see that her son was not gone forever, only moved to a safer place, and that every prayer, every moment of trust, and every time she held on despite the weight of her grief was building a bridge to him. And this is the beauty of how Allah deals with His servants, for He does not punish them for their brokenness, but uses their pain to bring them closer if they allow Him. And what felt like punishment was in fact protection, because Allah takes from this world to give in the next, and what appears as loss is often preservation, as the child who left this life is preserved in the gardens of Jannah, free from harm, waiting to welcome the one who loved him most. And while the mother at first thought her grief meant she had failed in faith, the truth is that even her questions were seen by Allah as the desperate words of a servant who needed Him. And He did not reject her, but drew her nearer through the very pain that shook her. And in this lies the educational wisdom that hardship is not meant to destroy, but to direct. To shift the believer from clinging to what is temporary to yearning for what is eternal. And that is why, when she moved from blame to surrender, her story became not one of despair, but of hope. Because she learned that Allah is never absent in the storm. He is the one carrying you through it. And even when you are angry, He is patient with you. Even when you question, He understands. And when you return, He welcomes you with open mercy. And so her journey with loss teaches us that no matter how broken we feel, no matter how heavy the pain, Allah's mercy is greater. His promise of reunion is true. And the child that was taken is not gone but waiting. So what felt like the end was only the beginning of a story that will culminate not in loss, but in eternal togetherness, in a place where there is no grief, no separation, and no end. There was once a woman who lost her son, and her world collapsed in a way that words could never fully describe, because the bond between a mother and her child is unlike any other. It is a bond woven into her very being. And when death snatched away her little one, her heart screamed with pain, and in her grief she blamed Allah. She looked at her loss and questioned how the one who is supposed to be merciful could allow such devastation to touch her life. And in that moment she thought she had failed in her faith, but in reality what she experienced was the raw humanity of grief. Islam teaches that tears, sorrow, and even questioning are not disbelief, but signs of the heart's vulnerability in the face of tragedy. When the Prophet lost his own son, he himself cried and said that the eyes shed tears and the heart grieves, but the tongue should not utter what displeases Allah. And this reminder shows that pain is acknowledged, grief is valid, and even the greatest of people were not immune to heartbreak. The woman's blame was not rejection of Allah, but a cry of helplessness, the desperate search for someone to hold responsible when life feels unbearable. And Allah, in His mercy, does not push away His servant for breaking down. He knows the weight of her sorrow and the limits of her strength. The Quran and Sunnah remind us that losing a child is one of the hardest tests, but it is also one of the greatest doors to Jannah, because that child is not lost forever, but preserved in the gardens of paradise, waiting at the gates to pull the parents by the hand until they are reunited. What seemed to her as abandonment was in fact an invitation, an opportunity to trust Allah beyond what she could see. And though at first her heart resisted, over time she came to realize that her son was not gone, only relocated into the safest hands, the care of the one who loves him more than she ever could. Her journey of grief was not meant to destroy her faith, but to redirect it, because in those early days of anger and blame, she thought Allah had taken something away to punish her, but slowly she learned that Allah never takes without giving back something greater. And what He withholds in this world is preserved in the next in a form that no eye has seen, no ear has heard, and no heart can imagine. The pain she carried was heavy, but in carrying it, she found herself drawn closer to Allah, because every time she cried, she also prayed. Every time she asked why, she also begged for strength. And every time she stumbled, she got up again and turned back. That is the meaning of Sabr, not the absence of grief, but the refusal to lose hope in Allah. Her child became her means of intercession, her reason to keep going, her light in the darkness, and she realized that every act of patience, every tear offered for Allah's sake, and every surrender of her will was building a bridge to her son in the hereafter. The story of her blaming Allah did not end in despair, but in transformation, for the same lips that once accused began to praise, and the same heart that once questioned began to trust, because she discovered that Allah was never absent from her pain. He was present in every heartbeat, carrying her through it and using her loss not to break her, but to build her into someone stronger, softer, and closer to Him. This is the truth of loss in Islam. It is not meant to strip you of hope, but to shift your gaze to eternity, reminding you that what is taken is not gone, it is waiting, and that every believer who bears such hardship with trust will one day see with their own eyes the mercy they could not understand in this world. There was a woman who lost her son, and the pain of that loss tore into her heart so deeply that she felt her world had ended, because to lose a child is to lose a part of yourself, a piece of your soul that you nurtured, carried, and loved more than anything else. In her brokenness, her grief turned into blame, and her lips uttered words against Allah that she never imagined she would say, because her heart was drowning and she could not understand how the one she prayed to, the one she believed to be merciful, could allow her to face such devastation. Yet this moment of blame was not disbelief, it was not rejection, it was the raw cry of a wounded human heart struggling to make sense of pain. Islam never denies the reality of such feelings, for even the Prophet wept at the death of his own son, saying that the eyes shed tears and the heart grieves. The tongue must not utter what displeases Allah, showing that grief itself is not a flaw of faith, but a natural response. What matters most is that in the middle of that storm of sorrow, one learns to find their way back to the one who is always near, even when the heart cannot feel Him. The woman thought her words of blame separated her from Allah, but in reality, He was closer than ever, understanding her struggle, seeing her tears, and waiting for her to turn back. Her journey through grief teaches that hardship is not meant to punish, but to purify, because when a child leaves this world, the pain is unbearable, yet Allah promises that the child is not gone, but preserved in the gardens of paradise, where no harm can ever touch them again. That child, whom she thought she lost forever, became a source of hope, for in Islamic tradition, children who die young wait at the gates of Jannah for their parents, refusing to enter until they are reunited. This knowledge reframes the narrative of her suffering, because what she saw as the end was only a beginning. What she thought was punishment was actually mercy in disguise, and what she believed was separation was in fact a promise of eternal togetherness. Slowly, as her tears continued and her heart wrestled with its pain, she came to see that her grief could be a path to Allah if she chose to hold on. Because patience in Islam does not mean you stop crying or that you stop feeling the ache of your loss. It means you keep your hope in Allah alive despite the tears. Through her struggle, she learned that even the moments when she felt angry at Allah were still moments that tied her to Him, because she was speaking to Him, crying to Him, asking Him, even if in confusion, and that in itself was a form of connection. Over time, her story became one of transformation. For the same heart that once questioned slowly began to trust, and the same lips that once uttered blame began to whisper gratitude, because she realized that Allah was not absent in her pain, but present in every moment, carrying her through what she thought she could never endure. Her son was no longer in her arms, but he was never gone. He was waiting for her in a safer place, and every act of patience, every dua, every prayer was building a bridge towards him. What once felt like punishment now felt like protection. Once seemed like abandonment became an opportunity for closeness to Allah. This is the wisdom of hardship in Islam. It breaks us not to destroy us, but to rebuild us into someone more aware, more humble, more connected to the one who never leaves. And so the woman who once blamed Allah found herself thanking Him, not because her pain disappeared, but because she discovered that even in her deepest grief, Allah's mercy was greater, his promise was real, and her story did not end in despair, but in hope. Hope that one day she would hold her child again in a place where there is no sorrow, no separation, and no end. There was a woman who carried the heaviest grief a mother could ever bear, the loss of her child, and in that moment her world collapsed into darkness. Every smile of her son echoed in her memory. Every step he had taken replayed like a wound that refused to close, and the silence left behind was unbearable. She felt betrayed by fate, confused by destiny, and the love she had poured into her child now had no place to go. In her agony, her heart cried out against the one who had given her that child, and she asked why he had taken him back so soon. Her lips uttered blame, not out of disbelief, but out of a desperate inability to reconcile mercy with suffering. Her pain was real, her sorrow raw, and it felt as though the heavens themselves had turned away. Yet what she could not see at first was that her words, even in blame, were still words directed to Allah, and that meant she was still connected to Him, even in her struggle, even in her storm of grief. Days turned into nights filled with restless tears, and nights turned into days where nothing seemed to matter. The woman believed her heart had been severed from Allah because she had doubted Him in her anger, but slowly she came to realize that even the prophets had cried. Even the strongest believers had moments of weakness, and grief was never a sign of lack of faith, but rather a sign of love. Islam acknowledges the pain of losing someone dearly beloved, and even the Prophet wept when his son died, showing that tears are not betrayal but compassion. The true danger lies not in crying or even questioning, but in turning away completely, and she had not turned away, for her pain was still being carried to Allah. Even if wrapped in confusion, gradually she learned that patience was not about suppressing her grief, but about not letting it break her connection with her Creator. Her child was gone from this world, but he was not lost forever, because the promise of reunion in paradise was stronger than any moment of despair in this life. As she began to reflect, her grief slowly transformed into understanding. She came to know that when Allah takes something away, it is never to abandon, but to elevate, never to destroy, but to purify. Her child had returned to a place where no harm could ever touch him, a place where innocence is preserved and joy never ends. She found solace in the knowledge that children who leave this world before maturity are waiting at the gates of Jannah for their parents, refusing to enter until they are reunited. What she had once seen as a cruel ending was in truth a divine promise of a more beautiful beginning. And what she had thought was separation was actually a path toward eternal togetherness. Each prayer she whispered, each tear she shed with hope, became a bridge leading her closer not only to her son, but also to her Creator. Her soul, once weighed down by anger and questions, slowly began to find relief in trust, because she realized that Allah's mercy is not diminished by hardship, but sometimes revealed through it. In time, the same woman who once questioned began to see her story differently. Her grief had not vanished, but it had been reshaped into a source of strength, a reminder that this world was never meant to be permanent, and that love in this world is only a shadow of the eternal love promised in the next. She realized her son had not been taken away. He had been entrusted back to Allah, and one day she would be reunited with him in a place where no pain could touch them. The anger that once filled her lips was replaced by gratitude, not because her suffering had disappeared, because she now understood that every hardship carried within it a hidden mercy. Her tears, once a symbol of despair, became a form of worship. For every time she cried to Allah, she was drawing nearer to Him. Her story became a testimony to the reality that even in the deepest pain, Allah never leaves, and what feels like the end can often be the beginning of a journey of healing, trust, and eternal hope. There was once a woman whose heart was shattered in a way that no words could truly describe, for she had lost her son, the light of her home, the joy of her arms, and the warmth of her heart. Every sound in the house echoed with his absence. Every corner reminded her of his laughter, and the silence that followed his departure became louder than any noise she had ever heard. In the storm of her grief, she cried out in confusion and pain, questioning why Allah had given her a gift only to take it back, and why mercy could be so hard to see in a moment filled with anguish. She blamed Allah, not because she did not believe, but because her heart was drowning in sorrow, unable to separate her love for her son from the bitterness of his loss. Her words were raw, her tears unending, and in her cries she felt both distant from Allah and yet unable to stop calling upon Him. Days passed where she could not sleep. Nights came where her tears did not end, and she thought perhaps she had sinned beyond forgiveness for daring to blame her Lord in her grief. Yet, as time moved gently forward, she realized that even in her pain, she was still turning to Allah, even if her words were filled with hurt rather than praise. What she thought was rejection was in fact her soul's desperate way of clinging to its creator. She began to understand that grief itself was not a failure of faith, for even the Prophet shed tears when his own child was taken, and his words reminded the believers that the heart grieves and the eyes weep, but the tongue must remain connected to Allah. Slowly, she saw that patience did not mean pretending not to hurt, but allowing the hurt to be carried with dignity and trust. Knowing that every cry lifted to Allah was heard and every tear was counted, as she reflected more deeply, her heart softened toward the wisdom of her test. She realized that Allah does not take except to give, and does not test except to raise a soul to a station it could never have reached without the trial. Her son was not lost, but safeguarded, not gone, but waiting, preserved in the gardens of paradise, where he would be untouched by the pain of this world. What had once looked like cruelty transformed in her heart into mercy, for she came to know that children who leave this world before their parents will intercede for them and pull them lovingly into Jannah, refusing to enter without them. This realization gave her a new perspective. Her separation was temporary, her loss was not final, and her patience would be the price of their eternal reunion. In that realization, she began to reshape her life. She prayed not just out of obligation, but out of longing to be closer to the one who held her son safely. Each supplication became a bridge connecting her heart to both Allah and her child. Her tears, once full of despair, became tears of surrender, because she knew that her grief was not unnoticed and her endurance was not in vain. She started to live with a different kind of strength, not the strength that hides pain, the strength that carries it with trust, knowing that Allah's plan is never empty and that his mercy is sometimes hidden within trials. Where once her lips spoke blame, now they whispered gratitude, for she saw how even in loss Allah was still giving her love guidance and the promise of eternal healing. Her story became one not of despair but of transformation. She discovered that blaming Allah had been the cry of her broken heart, but trusting Allah became the healing of it. Her son had not been taken to punish her, but to remind her of the true home they were both destined for, a home where she would hold him again forever. The pain did not vanish, but it was no longer meaningless, for it became her path to closeness with her Creator. She came to understand that every test is an invitation to rise, every wound can be turned into worship, and every loss can carry within it the seed of eternal gain. What began as bitterness evolved into beauty, and what once felt like abandonment became the deepest experience of Allah's nearness, teaching her that even when hearts are broken, Allah is the one who gathers the pieces and writes for them a story of strength, patience, and everlasting hope. There was once a woman whose world fell apart in a single moment, when she held in her arms the lifeless body of her son, the one she had carried, nurtured, and loved. With every beat of her heart, she had imagined his future, his laughter, his growing footsteps, and suddenly all of that was gone, leaving behind only silence and emptiness. Her grief was unbearable, her chest heavy with a sorrow that no words could express, and in that crushing pain she cried out, blaming Allah for taking away the one soul she could not imagine living without. Her heart felt betrayed by destiny. Her lips questioned why mercy would come in such a form. And she thought perhaps she had lost her faith altogether, because the tears that fell from her eyes carried with them anger, confusion, and despair. Yet what she did not realize in that moment was that even in her anger, she was still speaking to Allah, and that her connection to Him was not broken, only hidden beneath the weight of her grief. Days turned into weeks, and her sorrow lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. She could not pray without breaking down. She could not look at the world around her without seeing it empty of joy, and she feared that by blaming Allah, she had crossed a line she could never return from. As her pain unfolded, she began to remember that even the most beloved of creation had wept at the loss of loved ones, and even prophets cried when their children were taken from them. She came to understand that her grief was not a sign of weak faith, but a sign of deep love, and that Allah in His mercy does not punish a broken heart for crying, nor does He turn away a servant who struggles to make sense of suffering. Slowly, she learned that patience is not the absence of tears, but the ability to keep turning to Allah even when every part of you is in pain. Her heart began to see that she was not lost in her grief. She was being held through it. As she reflected more, her heart softened and began to recognize that Allah never takes except to give something greater, never tests except to raise the soul higher than it could have risen on its own. She realized her son was not lost to her, entrusted back to the one who loves him even more than she does, and that he was waiting in a place where there is no pain, no sickness, no death, only joy everlasting. The teachings she once knew in theory became her lifeline in practice, that children who leave this world early are in paradise, playing safe and whole, and they will intercede for their parents on the day of judgment, pulling them lovingly into Jannah, refusing to enter without them. What had once felt like cruel separation now revealed itself as divine protection and preparation for eternal reunion. She began to see that her patience, her prayers, and her trust would all become a bridge to meet her son again. This new perspective changed her relationship with Allah, where once her prayers had been mechanical, they now flowed with sincerity and longing. She prayed not just to ask for ease in her pain, but to feel close to the one who held her son in his care. Every tear she shed in remembrance became a form of worship, and every sigh of sadness became an offering to Allah, who never wastes the suffering of his servants. She no longer saw her grief as an obstacle to faith, but as a vehicle for it, because every moment she surrendered her pain to Allah, she felt a weight lifted from her heart. The anger that once made her lips blame now turned into words of trust, not because the pain disappeared, but because she realized Allah's love had never left her, and his plan was always unfolding with wisdom she could not yet fully see. In her transformation, she discovered a deeper strength she never knew she had. She learned that true resilience is not pretending everything is fine, but acknowledging the ache and still choosing to lean on Allah. She found peace in the thought that her child was safe and that her own trial was not a punishment but a gift in disguise, a way for her to rise spiritually, to detach from this fleeting world, and to anchor her hope in the eternal life to come. The story she once thought was about loss became a story about reunion. And the bitterness she once felt was replaced by gratitude for the promise of paradise and the closeness she now felt with Allah. Her son's absence became her reason to strive harder in worship, her reason to hold tighter to faith, and her reason to never let despair consume her again. In the end, her journey was no longer one of blaming Allah, but of realizing that he had always been with her, even in the darkest nights of her soul. Her grief had not destroyed her faith, it had purified it, reshaped it, and strengthened it. She came to see that every test carries within it a hidden mercy. Every heartbreak can draw the servant closer to the Creator, and every tear can water the seeds of eternal joy. The woman who once cried out in anger now cried out in surrender, and her heart bore witness to a profound truth that even when Allah allows pain, He always provides healing, and even when He takes what you love, He is never depriving you, but redirecting you to a greater love, a greater gift, and a greater reunion in the life to come, where no sorrow can ever touch again.